Introduction. Let me tell you how Wrestling with Joeylicious was born. The idea came to life when I was fresh off my hit comedy series Z-Rock, riding the wave of my newfound love for acting and creating TV. I realized pretty quickly that I wasn't going to be cast as a nuclear physicist or a suave secret agent anytime soon. But you know what? I could absolutely play Joey from Brooklyn. The world of Wrestling with Joeylicious is deeply personal to me, like an alternate reality rooted in my own life. It's a what-if scenario that asks, what if Joey didn't pursue his dream of being a professional drummer and instead took the path of becoming a professional wrestler? Growing up, drums and wrestling were my two greatest passions. I always knew that one, or maybe both, would play a major role in my life. And with this story, I got to explore what it would have been like if wrestling had been my destiny. To help bring this vision to life, I recruited my old friend from grammar school, Christopher Lynn, to help me write and shape this world. No one is more familiar with how and where we grew up than Chris. The shared experiences between him and I became the foundation for so much of the humor and heart in this story. Chris and I knew exactly how to take the world of Joeylicious and fill it with the authenticity, absurdity, and charm to make it feel so real. What makes this journey even more special is that every character in the Joeylicious universe is inspired by the people who helped shape me. From my mom, the ever-supportive and larger-than-life Mrs. Quesada, to my best friend Robert Scally, who's always been by my side. Each character is a reflection of someone who left a mark on my real life. This project became a way for me to combine everything I love: the drama and spectacle of wrestling, the humor and heart of everyday life, and the people who mean the most to me. It's a celebration of chasing dreams, no matter how far-fetched they might seem, and finding the comedy and joy in every stumble along the way. So, sit back and enjoy this wild ride into an alternate reality, one where Joey steps into the ring, faces larger-than-life challenges, meets and interacts with his wrestling heroes, and becomes Joeylicious. This is a world where anything can happen, where determination meets absurdity, and where a kid with big dreams gets to live them out in the most unexpected way. Welcome to the world of wrestling with Joeylicious. Chapter 1. The Italian Dream. As sound blared from the static-ridden, colored TV inside a modest, two-bedroom Brooklyn apartment, a pair of 10-year-old boys mimicked the noise levels from home. Looking at them, it was hard to imagine that they were the same age. Joey was already the size of a semi-pro beer league running back, his jet-black hair worn long and flowing over his broad shoulders. His best friend Robert Scally was short for his age, and his Irish heritage was only slightly harder to detect than Joey's Italian background. The blonde crew cut made Scally look more menacing than his 4'3" frame suggested, but his scrawny, pale arms couldn't lift a beanbag over his head if duty called. Her arms folded across her chest, Mrs. Quesada seemed to be resigned to the antics of her son and his best friend. Planted between the two boys, bouncing back and forth like a pinball, the 35-year-old hoped to minimize the fights and noise levels, but it was equally obvious from her expression that she knew it was a lost cause. With the 1984 WWF title match playing out on screen live from Madison Square Garden via the MSG network, with their favorite wrestler, Hulk Hogan, facing off against one of the most notorious heels in wrestling, the Iron Sheik, there was little hope that she would achieve much more than a few bruises from the overexcited youngsters. Joey barely kept his butt on the couch as his eyes were glued to the events unfolding on TV. His hair, albeit black, was clearly styled to look like his blonde hero Hulk Hogan, already 5.5 feet tall and 140 lbs. It was easy to imagine him one day being able to step into the ring, though at the moment, Mrs. Quesada would have been happy for him to act as mature as he looked. All he needed was a few more years of growing at his current pace, and he would be more than big enough to join the world that so fascinated him. Despite it being clear that Scally would never be large enough to follow his friend's athletic path, the young boy was just as enthusiastic about the match before them. "Come on, Hulkster!" Joey yelled at the TV. His mother leaned a little away from him, but quickly righted herself as equally enthusiastic chatter spewed from her son's best friend. "The Sheik can't win this, can he?" His words had started out with confidence, but uncertainty at what was unfolding on the screen made him start to feel far less certain how things would end. Joey had no such fear of what would happen. Not a chance, Scal. Get with it. The Hulkster would beat this sneaky uranium with one arm. Iranian, Mrs. Quesada corrected. It was no wonder he was getting C's in both science and geography. Ignoring Mrs. C's lesson in both subjects, Scally had more pressing concerns. He gets Hogan in that camel clutch, it's over. No one ever escapes that. It was something they had whispered about as being the only possible way the Iron Sheik could win, so it was definitely something both boys feared. Almost as if the Iron Sheik had heard that fear straight through the TV, he maneuvered around the Hulkster and wrapped his beefy arms around their hero's neck.
Now he's going for it. Camel clutch coming up. Yes, he's got it.
He's got it. No one has been able to escape that. Look at that. The Sheik really pulling on that chin of the Hulk.
No, Joey yelled as if he was personally locked in the struggle himself. I jinxed it, Scally declared, certain that this wouldn't have happened if he had simply kept his big mouth shut. Reaching over his mother, Joey showed that he agreed with this assessment. Shoving his best friend with the accidental force of Lenny from Of Mice and Men, Joey knocked Scally clear off of the couch. Her glare trained like a laser on her son. Mrs. Quesada spoke louder than the boys and the TV combined. Joey, play nice. Impossible, her son responded, too caught up in the moment to care what he had done. Scally scrambled back onto the couch, apparently accepting his punishment, but unwilling to miss any more of the action. Both boys watched in rapt awe as their hero did the impossible. As the MSG crowd cheered, the great blonde giant broke free from the camel clutch and turned on his opponent.
Look at he's powering his way up. He's made it to its knees. That takes the effect away from the hole. Hulk Hogan now stands up with a Sheik and rams it.
Yes, Joey yelled. Let's go, Hogan, win this thing, Scally screamed. Mrs. Quesada ignored the assault on her entire being, her own attention now focused on the events unfolding on TV. Once free of that impossible grip, the Hulkster grabbed the current WWF champion and tossed him against the ropes. The Iron Sheik's robes moved widely as he tried to regain his balance. Seeing his opportunity, Hogan moved in and delivered his own signature move, the Big Foot, which was simply a kick to the face. Unable to withstand the blow, the Sheik went down. Hogan then made certain that his foreign foe would remain canvas fodder by finishing him off with his equally famous leg drop, which was simply a drop of the leg onto his opponent's neck. Hogan was not reinventing sliced bread here. But then again, sliced bread never caused this much pain. As the Sheik moved groggily on the mat, the Hulkster pinned him.
Sheik going up. Hulk Hogan, he drops the big leg on him. He's down for the cover. Hook the leg. 1, 2. He got him.
As soon as the ref finished counting to 3, the boys exploded off the couch with the sound of the bell ringing on the TV. They stood on the couch yelling, jumping, and ultimately hugging at the unexpected outcome. All Mrs. Quesada could manage was a warm smile, as the boys seemed to forget that she was still in between them. After a minute of celebration, she finally broke the spell. All right, you two, take it easy. Her tone was more lighthearted than warning, but still had a hint that her mood would soon change. The celebration on the TV continued, but Joey seemed to have returned to the present, or at least returned to himself. A zen-like quality came over him. I have to win that belt someday. Mrs. Quesada looked at him as he stepped off the couch, her expression clearly softening. She knew, or at least prayed, that by the time Joey was an adult, such wild notions would be long gone. Scally, on the other hand, had no such sage insight from which to draw his reaction. Joey's words struck a chord in him. Of course. You'll be a beast. Look at you now at 10. Joey smiled. I picked out a name already. Really? What is it? Joey's smile widened, but he wasn't about to spoil the surprise. Scally grabbed the front of his shirt. Tell me. His voice was between pleading and threatening, but neither would work on his best friend. At least, not yet. Joey stood behind an old dirty curtain. He moved back and forth with anticipation as the ring announcer pulled the mic closer. The booming voice spoke over a fairly muted crowd. Here to bring the violence for you all tonight is the man of the hour, the tower of power, too sweet to be sour.
The Italian Dream, Joeylicious!
Take it back, do-do-do-do, take it back.
Well, I've been told by some people, and they all Take it back.
The St. Pat's Gymnasium wasn't a particularly large place for Saturday night wrestling, with seating for only about 150 on the surrounding rickety bleachers. But the boos that immediately sounded at the end of the announcer's words echoed as if they were delivered from the Grand Canyon. The Irish grammar school was noisy all day, so this was just more of the same. What was different was the way the gym had been set up. Cheap banners welcomed the roughly 25 fans to the Brooklyn's Really Awesome Wrestling League, or Brawl, and although the max seating capacity was 150, this was considered a sellout. Welcome to the lowest rung of the wrestling world. Joeylicious stepped out into the gym, his arms reaching above his head. As soon as he emerged, the crowd began throwing things at him. After more than 20 years of wrestling experience, Joeylicious was quite accustomed to this response as he entered the ring. The years hadn't been particularly kind to him. He had only grown another 5 inches since he had been 10 years old, reaching 5'11" by the time he turned 20, now in his 40s. His once rippling muscles weren't so rippling anymore, and the genesis of a bulging gut was beginning to form. Still, he was in remarkably good spirits considering his current state. His outfit was a black singlet with red boas and a cape, making him look more like a WWF villain from the 1980s than a present-day hero. His hair was still long, but he had added blonde highlights to his black locks, at least partly to hide the gray hairs he had started to notice recently. The announcer continued, "And his opponent..." The crowd began to cheer, nearly drowning out the announcer's words. The announcer pulled the mic closer and nearly shouted into it, bringing his extraordinary looks and luck with him all the way from Ireland, built like a rock and ready to sock, the undefeated Irish assassin, Paddy Shamrock. The cheers became deafening as a tall, muscular 21-year-old stepped out and headed toward the ring. As he approached Joeylicious, there was clear contempt on his face. Paddy Shamrock offered his hand, but quickly pulled it back as Joeylicious reached out to shake it. Paddy ran his hand through his hair and turned to the small crowd, a wide grin on his face. He then waved at his adoring, though small, group of fans. One small fan of tonight's Italian sacrificial lamb stood up on the back bleachers. Still Joey's best friend and also his manager, Scally didn't appear to have grown much either, reaching only about 5'5" and still very scrawny. The white, wife-beater tank top didn't do his small arms any favors, more highlighting his fragile bones than drawing attention to his puny muscles. Holding a styrofoam cup of beer, Scally yelled down at the crowd favorite, "Suck it, Shamrock!" Beside him, a filthy-looking man with a massive beer gut turned, "Sit down, you drunk." Suddenly aware of the man who had been eyeing him warily, Scally sensed a chance to unleash some of his own tension. "Hey, this is the visitor section." "There is no visitor section." The man is clearly exasperated. "I just claimed it," Scally shot back, almost as if he were hoping for a fight. Before anything could happen between them, the bell rang, signaling the beginning of the fight. Not wanting to waste his time on Scally, the man rolled his eyes and faced the ring, muttering, "Loser." Scally, thankfully missing the cold diss, turned his attention to the two professional combatants beginning to face off. Unfortunately, it was very clear early on that Joeylicious didn't stand a chance against his opponent. After being tossed around like a rag doll and being the recipient of several body slams, pile drivers, and clotheslines, it seemed as if Joeylicious wouldn't even get in a single good shot, or a bad shot, or any shot. Climbing back up on his feet, though, Joeylicious took Paddy by surprise. With a burst of energy, he managed to get in a solid jab to his opponent's face, sending Paddy down to the canvas. The crowd let out a gasp, and Joeylicious played his sudden good fortune up. Holding his arms in the air, he strutted close to the ropes to get more of a reaction from the bloodthirsty fans of the young Irishman, who, let's face it, wasn't really from Ireland. From behind, Paddy caught Joeylicious off guard with an elbow to the back of his head. The Italian Dream's view of the audience quickly changed to a view of the asbestos-ridden ceiling. Paddy came into view, and Joeylicious knew exactly what was coming next. Paddy was tall, but not that tall. Clearly, he had climbed onto the top rope. With a stunning splash, he crashed onto Joeylicious and pinned him until the ref counted to 3. The crowd immediately burst into cheers for their fighter. Everyone except Scally, who was now itching for a fight of his own. Foul, disqualification. Besides Scally, Paddy's beer-gutted fan responded with annoyance. "Are you going to start that again?" His temper unchecked, Scally chucked his now empty styrofoam cup at the fan, smacking him square in the face. The fan immediately responded by attacking Scally. Just like his best friend, Scally didn't stand a chance. Visitor section or not. Chapter 2. Brawl. After wiping his sweaty face with a towel, Joey wrapped it around his neck and moved over to the bench of St. Patrick's locker room. Flopping down, he felt a bit defeated. Well, more than a bit. He just got his ass kicked. The other 3 wrestlers present largely ignored him as they had their own problems to deal with. When Lou Rosati entered, all heads turned to hear what he has to say. Was this the school janitor? No, this short, stubby, greasy man who would finish runner-up to Danny DeVito in a beauty contest, if such a beauty contest existed, actually ran the day-to-day operations of Brawl. And he looked thrilled to this fact. Joey already had a beef. Lou, does Shamrock have his own trailer or what? He never showers with us. With a shrug, Lou responded, "What do you want to wash his balls?" It soon became clear that Joey wasn't the only one suspicious of his wannabe Irish rival. Una Granada, a once handsome Latino, spoke up from his locker. "I hear he's being groomed for high school venues." His tone was more of an accusation than a question. Despondently, Joey shook his head. "Lost to him 3 times already." Lou shrugged again. "You're Italian. It's a rivalry." It was obvious that he was evading what the men actually wanted to know. Joey pointed over to a tall, trim African-American who looked more like a basketball player than a wrestler. "What about Milkshake? The Irish get along with the blacks all of a sudden?" Suddenly pulled into the conversation, Milkshake made it clear he wasn't any better off. "He beat my ass 4 times. "Ridiculous," Joey said, his eyes focused on Lou. Trying to blow off the concern, Lou gave them all a look. Then he focused on Joey. "Quit whining. You win next week on your home turf." This was news to Joey. "We're at STA next week?" Knowing that was the perfect distraction, Lou grinned. "Happy now?" Jumping up, Joey pumped his fist. "Yeah, baby. You beat Tiny." This was less welcome news. Looking over at the massively overweight man who looked like a reformed skinhead who had spent too many years on the couch attacking ice cream bars instead of barbells, Joey responded, "What?" "No," he looked back at Lou. At nearly the same time, Tiny looked up. "What'd I do?" Joey vigorously shook his head. "How am I supposed to beat Tiny convincingly? I can't even lift him." As if to dismiss this, Tiny held up his hands, exposing a few tattoos. "Shamrock slams me." Waving a hand at the man, Joey tried to shut him up. "Tiny, I don't want to hear it. I love you, but you're enormous." Before anyone could respond, an unwelcome Scally strolled in, a huge grin on his lips and a large ice pack over his eye. "Heck of a job tonight, fellas. Heck of a job." His voice brimmed with happiness as he thought about the events of that night. There was a round of half-hearted hellos before most of the men returned to what they were doing before Lou had entered. Joey shook his head at his so-called manager. "How is it you always look more beat up than me?" Like Lou, Scally chose to avoid answering the question directly. His tactic was a bit more obvious, though. "Any drink tickets left?" "I gave you all mine already. Milkshakes, too." Scally turned to the man with the Kevin Durant physique, albeit a foot shorter. "Yeah, thanks, chocolate milkshake." With the contempt it deserved, "It's Milkshake." "Well, you're black, so I figured." This caused Milkshake to break things down for the accidental bigot. "And you're white, but I just call you Cracker. Not vanilla cracker, just plain cracker." "They don't have vanilla crackers. I'd have to be a cookie." Scally beamed at how clever he felt. As if nothing were happening, Tiny moved away from his stuff and strode toward the shower wearing only a small towel around his waist. This had the unfortunate effect of a beach whale covering his privates with a napkin. Una Granada held up his hands. "Whoa, my man!" His wavy hair moved with his motions, as did a bit of his own fat that he had accumulated around his midsection. Yeah, he was past his prime as well. Joey averted his eyes, fearing what could happen next. "Tiny! Damn!" Milkshake added to the protests. Shaking his head while looking up at the ceiling, Una Granada asked, "Didn't we get you that extra-large robe last month?" "It's in the wash." "What? I can't take a shower?" His tone showed complete indifference to the protests around him. Waving his hand, Una Granada hoped that the large man would just move out of sight before the towel decided to succumb to gravity. "All yours." As Tiny strode out of view, Lou brought the focus back around to himself. "All right, let me pay you dummies and get out of here." Milkshake moved forward, a huge grin on his face. "That's what I'm talking about." As he handed out the cash, Lou asked, "By the way, everybody bring your A game next week. We may have a special visitor." Looking up from his earnings, Una Granada asked, "Who?" "Just bring it, all right, Una Granada." Joey beamed down at his earnings. "Nice! $47.50. Sweet!" his best friend chimed in. His response was just enough to distract Joey. As soon as the wrestler looked up, Scally snatched the money out of his hand. "I'll meet you at the bar." With that, Scally exited in a flash. Still not dressed to leave, all Joey could do was yell after his friend, "Damn it, Scally, get back here!" Rethinking the matter, Joey quickly grabbed his stuff and ran out as well. The pair arrived at the Casada apartment well into the night, making far too much noise as they entered. It was the same apartment from Joey's childhood, and it hadn't changed much at all. Yes, Joey still lived with his mom. $47.50 only went so far, whether he kept it away from Scally or not. Looking up and realizing they were home, Joey whispered at his drunk friend, "Quiet!" Offended by the demand, Scally looked at him. "What'd I say?" From another part of the apartment, the pair were greeted by the familiar voice of Mrs. Casada. "Joey, is that you?" Hitting his friend in the chest, Joey yelled back, "Yeah, Ma, go back to sleep." Scally rubbed his chest, muttering about the abuse his friend had dished out. He froze as soon as Joey's mom asked the question they had both dreaded. "Scally's with you?" It was definitely more of a statement than a question. Doing his best to avoid lying, Joey responded with the answer to a completely different question. "It's Saturday." As if appeased, his mom shouted back, "I'm going to 8 o'clock mass in the morning. Or keep it down." With that, Joey knew that she knew Scally was with him. "We will!" Scally stumbled into the wall as Joey made the promise. "You all right?" Joey asked. "Man, I gotta stop drinking." Scally slurred back at him. "I'll grab some beers from the fridge," the little man said as he stumbled through the door. Knowing that his friend would at least take great care when retrieving beers of any kind, Joey simply shook his head at the mixed message. To his surprise, Scally also managed to keep his voice down as they made their way toward the bedroom right after. As they walked in, the room obviously hadn't changed much since Joey was 10, in the same way Joey hadn't changed, period. It was a wrestling shrine. Posters and memorabilia of WWF, WWE, NWA, AWA, and WCW legends were everywhere. Not surprisingly, all things Hulk Hogan were especially prominent. In a way, Joey was a relic trapped inside a room of other relics. Sprawled out on the bed, Scally downed a beer while watching Joey pace. "Quit sulking already and drink up!" His hand missed picking up a fresh beer on the first-time attempt, but managed to get a hold of one on the second. Taking aim, Scally threw the beer to his friend. Or at least he hoped it was to his friend. The sound of the bottle smashing against the wall proved otherwise. Joey glared at him as Scally accused, "Come on, Joe, ruined a perfectly good beer. You're cleaning this up," Joey hissed back. He had not expected Scally to chuck a beer toward him, otherwise he might have caught it. When did Scally ever part with a beer anyway? Scally shot up at his words. "That's it!" His voice was far too loud. "First thing tomorrow we start getting you back in shape. 5 o'clock sharp." Joey gave his friend a withering look. "You'll be hungover at 5 a.m. "No, I'll still be drinking. 5 p.m., he clarified with pride. "Right," Joey rolled his eyes. First thing, his friend's antics weren't doing much to bolster his spirits. Sitting down heavily on the foot of his bed, Joey stared at the floor. Seeing his friend feeling particularly dejected, Scally went into managerial mode to bring Joey out of his funk. With great reluctance, he put the beers aside and stood up. "Do that new combination on me." Joey looked up at him. It was a nice gesture, but there was no chance he would try it on Scally. "It's devastating. You'll break something." Hopping around like a one-legged boxer, Scally said, "No, I won't." "Okay, you'll separate something. Like when I messed up your shoulder at Chrissy Mann's Sweet 16. Scally stopped moving. "I'm a man now." "You're a toothpick," Joey shot back. Realizing there was only one way to get his much larger friend to spring into action, Scally put Joey in a headlock. "Come on, bring the violence." The hold having little to no effect on Joey, he said, "Would you cut it out? I'm tired." "I'll choke you out, punk ass." Finally, without warning, Joey grabbed his tiny friend, flipped him over, and tossed him into the wall. Well, not into the wall exactly. More like through the wall, for Scally was now embedded upside down inside the sheetrock. Scally looked up helplessly. He was good and stuck. Before Joey could rescue his friend, the bedroom door flew open. "Robert Scally, what did you do?" Mrs. Casada stood in the doorway, her gray hair pinned up in rollers and her pink nightgown flowing with the breeze she created when she made her entrance. She looked more like an aging Valkyrie than Joey's mother. "What did I do?" Scally protested from his unmovable position. Something else caught Mrs. Casada's attention. "And what a surprise, beers!" Her glare turned to her son. "You know I can't stand when he drinks in here. I had like 10, 11 beers." "So what?" Scally pleaded his case further. Of course this was the wrong thing to say to the already fuming 60-year-old woman. "Get out of this apartment." "Ma, you said he could sleep over," Joey said, feeling betrayed. "You want to go too?" Joey knew it was useless arguing with his mother in her state, so he just yanked Scally out of the wall. This caused further pain to his friend, and an even larger hole in the wall. Mrs. Casada could only shake her head in disappointment as her son tossed the drunken Scally over his shoulder and carried him away. After making sure Scally got home safely, Joey stood in front of Scally's parents' place watching his friend fumble with the key to the front door. It was quite the ordeal. After dropping the key onto the porch a few times and trying to use it in the broken doorbell at least twice, Scally managed to stagger through the threshold. Feeling that his job was finally done for the night, Joey turned and headed home. Once he was inside the house, Scally tripped over the shoe rack and hit the floor. Deciding that it wasn't worth the effort to stand, he crawled across the living room to the area near the window that was usually cool. Only the window was shut. Focusing on what was in front of him, he suddenly realized that he had to use the bathroom. Badly. In a haze, Scally thought he could see the toilet. Not entirely sure how he managed to reach the bathroom so quickly, he used the wall to haul himself off the floor. Staggering around, he undid his pants and took aim at the middle toilet. He currently saw 3. Once he finished relieving himself, Scally let gravity run its course. He crashed to the floor and drifted off to sleep. The lush wasn't aware of the sounds of descending footsteps, or even the short, dark figure that was suddenly looming over him. "Christ," the figure muttered. Looking down at the spread-eagle disgrace on the floor, the man with blondish white hair shook his head in disgust. It was obvious by the look on his face that this was nothing new. In fact, it was usually much worse. Or so he thought. "Get up, dummy." Scally's father nudged his drunken son with his foot. Apart from the slipper seeming to tickle the drunk, there was no real reaction. Taking a deep breath and wiping beads of sweat from his forehead, the poor man was clearly at a loss and uncomfortable. 100 degrees down here," he muttered, his attention now more on his own discomfort than the regular sight of his son passed out on the floor. Leaning over his son, the older man turned on the fan. Instead of the relief he hoped to get from a bit of cool air, Mr. Scally felt liquid coming off of the fan. Perplexed, he stepped away from it. "What the?" Quickly turning off the fan, Mr. Scally wiped the new wetness off his face and sniffed to see if he could detect what the liquid was. Immediately, he scrunched up his face and held his hand away. "Ugh! Scally, you idiot, get up!" No longer restraining himself, Scally's father yanked his small son up to his feet. Only partially awake, Scally casually replied, "I'm in the bathroom, Pop. Be right out." Giving his son a good shake, the old man growled, "You're in the living room." Chapter 3. The Hulkster and Highlights. As disastrous as the previous night had been, Joey woke the next morning feeling a bit better about his future. Not only was his next match on his home turf, Lou had given everyone a heads up to prepare for something big. If there was a scout coming, Joey definitely wanted to bring his A game, and that meant some touch-ups to his appearance. But first, he would leap out of bed for a quick workout. Or would he? After deliberating with himself for a whole 3.5 seconds, he decided to double down on comfort and curl back under his Italian dream sheets instead. After all, these sheets were in Joeylicious's own likeness, which is to say his own likeness. Many would find this creepy. Joey unfortunately did not. 3 or 4 hours later, Joey finally crawled out of bed, grabbed his wallet, and made his way to the Rite Aid store a few blocks away. He also put on street clothes first. Normally, what is understood doesn't need to be discussed, but this is Joey we're talking about. For the record, he usually gets dressed before going outside. So now outside his apartment, but inside the Rite Aid, Joey scanned through the hair dye aisle. Finding the perfect color, he snatched it up. His grin quickly faded as he caught sight of the price tag on the box. $9.99, he cried, as if it were the box's fault for this grave injustice. Suddenly, a large figure loomed directly behind Joey, the figure's equally large hands on his equally large hips. This creature was big, at least twice the size of Joey in both directions. However, it was an eerily familiar voice that finally got Joey's attention.
Don't worry, Lish. Uncle Sam will let you write that off.
Always the wisecracker, or at least picking up the slack when Scally wasn't around, Joey greeted the figure. I haven't turned around yet, but I'm sensing you're rather large for an accountant. Ignoring his reply, the figure said,
We need to talk.
Turning around to force this oversized being to address his wit head-on, Joey found himself face-to-face with his own personal hero, Hulk Hogan. From the signature yellow bandana to the Hulkamania t-shirt, the man looked exactly the way he used to look on TV, just older, a lot older. Stunned, all Joey could manage was to point out the obvious. Hulk Hogan?
In the flesh, brother.
His mind racing to catch up with this incredible stroke of luck, Joey said, You shop in Rite Aid too? I figured you'd be looking into hair plugs before dealing with those not-so-golden locks. Joey didn't always make a good first impression, and clearly not appreciating this fact, Hogan replied, with a quick jab to Joey's face. Joey reeled, falling hard against the floor. Grabbing his nose and trying to pinch the blood from pooling out, Joey almost pouted, What? Can't take constructive criticism? All I meant was, why do a brand new paint job on an '84 Camaro? Not a great second impression either. Hogan bounced off the aisle and brutally handed Joey his signature leg drop. Standing up and dusting himself off, Hogan followed with,
Are you ready to shut up and listen to what I have to say?
Groaning from the floor. The not-so-young but aspiring wrestler clearly was and was not. I'm in too much pain to talk. Giving a satisfied nod, Hogan said,
Good. Now get your ass up.
Folding his arms across his chest, he waited for the Italian dream to find his footing, which took a little longer than it should have. Finally, with a determined look on his face, Hogan said,
I'm here to take you under my wing.
Unable to believe what he just heard and now gasping for air at the shock, Joey responded, You mean like my prodigy?
Did those highlights seep into your brain? Protege?
Hogan retorted.
To be even clearer, so a simple-minded fellow like yourself can understand, I want to be your mentor.
Trying to clear his head, Joey made a victory fist before opening his mouth again. When he was sure he wouldn't say anything else stupid, he proclaimed, This is the greatest day of my life.
You need a change of pace, Lish. Can you act? My career didn't take off till I was Thunderlips in Rocky III.
I played Kaniki in Greece at my 6th grade talent show.
What place you come in?
8th.
How many competitors?
Including me? Joey tried to look like he was reflecting, but he knew that his answer wouldn't be great. 7.
That math just doesn't work out for you, brother.
Feeling his pride wounded, Joey shot back, What do you know about acting? Siskel and Ebert didn't exactly give Suburban Commando 2 thumbs up. I think they gave it the finger. Okay, that qualified as something else stupid. So, after dazing Joey with a double overhead chop to the skull, Hogan finished off the would-be wrestler with a body slam. Behind them, at the opposite end of the aisle, an elderly African-American woman looked on in confusion, not entirely sure how to react to the violence taking place in front of her eyes. Hoping to salvage this once-in-a-lifetime encounter, Joey groaned, Hulkster, can you hurry up with this mentorship? I'm starting to lose consciousness. Taking pity on his chosen student, Hogan leaned over and helped him to his feet. But as Joey stood up ready to thank his hero for the help, something caught his eye. Holy crap!
What is it?
Hogan looked for what had caused such a reaction. Anne-Marie Degrassi. She was in love with me in the 7th grade.
The lady behind the register?
They both watched as the reasonable, attractive female cashier who looked about Joey's age dealt with a customer, neither of them paying any attention to the 2 men who had just been wrestling in the store. Nodding his approval, Hogan said,
She's cute.
You should have seen her in the 7th grade.
Why would I look at her when she was in the 7th grade? I was a grown man then.
I'm just trying to give you a frame of reference, Hulkster. You don't have to get so technical.
You didn't know she worked here?
Looking at his mentor with shock, Joey vigorously shook his head. No, I'm not a stalker.
Who said anything about that?
Joey stared at Anne-Marie Degrassi as he broke the situation down. My mom usually buys my hair dye, but she's pissed about the wall. Naturally, this explanation caused more confusion than enlightenment.
You have a guilty conscience, Lish.
Hey, she was in love with me, all right?
Your mom?
Grimacing at the suggestion, Joey replied, No, Anne-Marie. And, yes, my mom. but in a different way. Jesus, Hulkster, get with it here.
I'm with it plenty. Go talk to her.
It was Joey's turn to be confused. Who? My mom?
No, Anne-Marie.
Right, but what do I say?
Just reintroduce yourself and see where it leads. But be cool about it. Don't be asking if she still carries the torch for you, or if she has a fella. She'll file a restraining order faster than you can pay for that L'Oreal.
The solution sounded much easier than Joey knew it actually was. Hoping to get a little backup from his mentor, he asked, "Can't you come up there with me?"
No, that's out of my purview.
Perv what? I feel like I need a dictionary when I talk to you. You would never know English was Joey's first and only language. Instead of explaining what he meant, Hogan grabbed his failing student and shoved him forward. Joey reached Anne-Marie just as the customer took his change and left. Trying to act casual but coming off like a loon, he said, "Anne-Marie de Gracie." The cute cashier looked up and an expression of confusion crossed her face. "Cliff?" Taken aback and immediately jealous of any member of the male species who Anne-Marie may or may not have been friendly with, he said curtly. "Who's Cliff?" Anne-Marie's eyes went wide and she covered her mouth for a second. "Oh my God!" Pulling her hands away, she looked him up and down. "Joey Casada, I didn't recognize you with those highlights." Not ready to let go of her initial response, Joey continued to look at her suspiciously. "So for the record, Cliff's not important to you?" Still in shock at seeing her old would-be flame. Anne-Marie seemed excited about the reunion. "How are you?" "It's been like 30 years. Deciding that her reaction was passable, Joey beamed, "Yeah, crazy, right? I'm still wrestling and all, so things are good. Can I get your new phone number?" This was the clearest definition of jumping the gun. With a laugh, Anne-Marie said, "Wow, do you work that fast in the ring?" "Actually, I rely more on my strength and speed." "Come on, let me take you out. I'm free every night this week, during the day, too." A wall never stopped Joey from achieving his goals. Just ask Scally. Shaking her head, Anne-Marie replied, "I'm not. I'm the manager here. Just helping with the register because the new girl called in sick." Pushing down his disappointment, Joey tried to sound cheerful. "Management, nice. So stock in the company?" "The works? Not exactly. A huge opportunity just presented itself to me as well." Joey looked behind him almost conspiratorially. Speaking up, he said, "Hulkster, you sure you don't want to pop out and say hello?" Looking past Joey, Anne-Marie asked, "Who are you talking to?" When Hogan didn't come out, Joey dismissed it. "Never mind. Hey, you remember the Halloween dance? Sister Marie had to keep separating us during the slow songs." The smile on the manager's face faded. "You went to the Halloween dance with Rebecca Rizzo." Feeling a little foolish, Joey tried to correct himself with equal clumsiness. "I meant our graduation dance." Anne-Marie's smile was now a slight frown. No, that was Stacy Alonzo. Fumbling for another instance that could possibly have been Anne-Marie, he asked, "Scally's block party?" "Jennifer Carazzi." Suddenly her smile reappeared, and with a twinge of playful sarcasm, "You were a popular guy back then." Glad that she didn't seem as upset as he was, Joey tried to shrug it off. "Yeah, I guess I was, but you and me, that was special. You must be married now. That's the roadblock here, isn't it?" Anne-Marie gave him a stunned look. Mistakenly taking this as an invitation to keep going, Joey continued, "I can sense you still have feelings for me." That did it. That familiar voice once again interrupted his shopping.
Restraining order.
Before Joey could even look over, Hogan took him down with a flying clothesline. Joey smashed into a cardboard display advertising on-sale Hershey bars, and the elderly African-American woman stood just off to the side, shaking her head at the scene. She looked down at the Italian nut job. "Forget the hair dye and chocolate bars. You should be shopping for medication." The old woman put her stuff down and headed for the door. Joey got up a bit dazed. His mentor was nowhere to be seen. "Hulkster," he called out, "where'd you go? Does this mean I won't be your prodigy?" Anne-Marie moved to the edge of the counter and looked at him with concern in her eyes. "Joey, are you having a seizure? Should I call someone?" Chapter 4. Father Randazzo and Tidy Whities. Joey sat uncomfortably at the table with his mother and Scally. His mother was being unusually quiet as she glared at his best friend. Finally, she broke her silence. "Joey, why is this person in my kitchen?" Scally opened his mouth. Knowing exactly where that misbegotten response was heading, Joey held up his hand to stop his friend from adding gasoline to the soon-to-be blazing fire. "Don't." It was his only warning. Looking his mother in the eye, Joey said, "Scally has been my best friend. and most loyal supporter since forever. This was also clearly the wrong approach as she shot back, and look where that's gotten you. Undeterred, Joey pressed on. We had our first class, served our first mass, and saw our first match together. Surely that worked because older people love to be reminded of the good old days, right? Then Scally couldn't help but speak up, Snooka Superfly from the top of the cage, baby. As if this was the perfect way to emphasize their point, the two men gave each other a high five. Turning back to his mother, Joey said, Scally's always been there for me and now he needs my help, our help. Her eyes widened. Mrs. Quesada said, my God, his parents finally threw him out. Trying to stem the damage, Joey pleaded, let me finish, holding her hand up. His mother said, don't even say it. Joey pressed further, just till he gets back on his feet. Looking at her son over her glasses, Mrs. Quesada said, he's a fully formed adult who hasn't been on his feet yet. Unable to read the room, Scally chimed in the way Scally always chimed in. I'll stand up right now if that'll settle it. Completely nonplussed, Mrs. Quesada ignored the loyal to a fault half-wit. She was going to nip this problem in the bud. She was not about to have Scally-sized holes in every room of the apartment. He's not staying here. Switching tactics, Joey asked, Ma, what would Jesus do? Don't give me that. You haven't been to church since forever. He'll sleep in my room. You have one bed. We'll share. Throwing her hands up, his mother moaned, does any part of this conversation get any better? Seeing that he was finally getting through to her, Joey tossed in an incentive, he'll quit drinking. Taken aback, Mrs. Quesada paused, her eyes shifting to Scally. Pressing his luck, Scally said, in here. Wrinkling her nose, Mrs. Quesada asked, what does that mean? He won't drink in the apartment, Joey explained. Smelling a rat, Mrs. Quesada glared at both of them. But he can still drink outside the apartment? Baby steps, Ma, come on. Mrs. Quesada looked at Scally, who was literally holding his breath. Her cold exterior cracked, but she wasn't going to give in completely without things being on her terms. I have to be at the lunchroom every morning at 7. The two of you will not keep me up at night. Lights out by 11, not a minute after. Surprise and happiness crossed Joey's face. So he can stay? Holding up a finger, Mrs. Quesada continued to add terms to the agreement. Neither of you will ever miss Sunday dinner. Beaming, Joey replied, Scal can do that. And when have I ever missed Sunday dinner? Best cook in the world, you kidding me? Lowering his head and holding up his hand, Scally spoke quickly. Thanks, Mrs. C. Not quite done yet, she looked between the two man-childs. One more thing. Just from her tone, Joey knew this was going to be a rough ask. Possibly even a deal-breaker. Deciding it was worth the risk, he said, anything. You name it. That was when the hammer came down. You get jobs, both of you. Stunned, Joey looked at his mother. A wry grin formed on his face. Ma, I'm a professional wrestler. I make almost $50 an hour before expenses. His mother wasn't fooled by the logic. She knew exactly how much he worked. Her eyes let her son know that she wasn't even slightly amused. You wrestle 1 hour a week. Sensing that he needed to step up, Scally offered, I can look into getting my old job back at the bike shop. Mrs. Quesada's annoyance turned to the imp. Didn't you get caught stealing there? It was a cruel reminder. Still, Scally wasn't about to give up. With a smile, he elaborated on what had happened. A Schwinn, I was just borrowing it for a test ride. Borrowing, stealing, mere semantics. Not wanting to hear any more excuses or nonsense, Mrs. Quesada waved off his words. Do what you have to. Her attention returned to her son. As for you, we're going to visit an old friend tomorrow. Who? She gave him a knowing smile. Bring your prayer book. Joey gulped. Mrs. Quesada marched her son back to a place that was very familiar, but one that Joey had rarely been to in years, at least during the day. Looking around, he couldn't help but feel little had changed. This was St. Thomas Aquinas, Joey's former grammar school. His mom headed off to work in the cafeteria, which doubled as the gymnasium. This was Joey's home turf, and he would be back Saturday night to defend it. So why not sneak in a grueling cardio workout while his mother slung hash? The workout would turn out to be a mere 2 laps around the gym. But to be fair to Joey, his leisurely pace didn't break into a full walk until the second half of the second lap. After all, he did have his standards. Mrs. Quesada helped prepare the meals in the kitchen, then moved out front to serve them. As always, the kids were rowdy and mouthy. The younger kids had already gone through, so she had to deal with the 7th graders. Her least favorite age group, this always made her particularly grumpy. Adjusting her apron, she focused on serving until one of the boys began to complain. "Didn't we have this yesterday?" Flashing a bemused look, Mrs. Quesada countered, "You want variety? Try ordering off the menu." The boy honestly looked surprised. "We have menus?" Clearly, sarcasm was a concept this C- student was yet to grasp. Waving him off, Mrs. Quesada said, "Get going." She dropped a spoonful of mush on his plastic tray and glared until he left. As she watched him go, Mrs. Quesada couldn't help but feel that the future of the planet was in peril. "Is it possible they'll be dumber than my son?" As if the mere mention of her son had been enough to summon Joey, he shoved a kid to the side, cutting the line. He smiled at his mom as he held out an empty tray. There were many protests around him as a chorus of 7th graders yelled, "Hey!" Like her son, Mrs. Quesada entirely ignored them. She greeted Joey with a short, "You're late." With a shrug, Joey nudged his tray closer, as if asking her not to be cheap with the portions. No portions forthcoming, he excused his own lateness by saying, "Had to finish my cardio. Big match Saturday." Annoyed, but knowing that they needed to get moving, Mrs. Quesada grumbled, "I'll give you cardio." She ripped off her apron as she called out to one of her coworkers, "Claire, take over." Looking down at his lonely tray, Joey felt his stomach growl, "Can I eat first?" Giving him a look over her glasses. Mrs. Quesada let him know what she thought of his request. She didn't even respond to it. "Let's go." Pleading, Joey cried, "I'm hungry," but it was no use. Finally caving to the lost cause, Joey put down his tray and trotted off after his mother, who was a lot faster than she had any right to be. He was almost out of breath by the time he caught up to her. And by the time they climbed 2 flights of stairs and reached an office door, he appeared to have a collapsed lung as he hunched over, huffing and puffing. Mrs. Quesada paid Joey's athletic shortcomings no mind. What was behind this door was the paramount issue at hand, and Joey suddenly became aware of that fact. He straightened nervously as his mother knocked. Behind this door was the possibility of a job that had absolutely nothing to do with wrestling. A real job. What could be more frightening? An ominous voice answered to the knock, and Mrs. Quesada opened the door for her son. Joey entered like a house pet being dragged through the threshold of a veterinarian office. Sitting behind the desk that Joey knew was for the principal of the school was a familiar face, though he was clearly a lot older than when Joey had last seen him. His warm brown hair was entirely white now, but Father Randazzo had managed to keep most of it. The hair on his head looked like a tamed cloud. He peeked up from his paperwork. Diplomas and framed photos of students and faculty hung about, as if he was just as proud of the people who had passed through the school than any of his own degrees. When he saw who had entered, the priest smiled, "Well, well." A look of relief passed over Joey's face. For whatever reason, he'd expected to see the same evil nun, Sister Marie, behind the desk, who had doled out Nazi-like punishment when he had attended the school. Like when Scally blew up a toilet in the girls' bathroom with an M80. Of course, Joey was his unwitting accomplice. Or when Joey refused to cut his long flowing hair that went past his shirt collar. Jesus had long hair, so why couldn't he? Somehow that logic didn't work on the nun. Scally's illogical excuse for blowing up the toilet didn't work much either. As Joey continued to reflect, he did the math and concluded that the old nun must be 6 feet under by now, and good riddance. But he never thought in a million years that her replacement would be Father Randazzo. This priest was actually cool. He tried to mentor Joey back in the day. He tried with Scally as well, but that project was aborted in the crib. "Father Randazzo, you're the principal now?" Laughing as he stood up, Father Randazzo replied, "For almost 20 years, Joseph, if you would only come to Mass." Feeling a moment of shame, Joey looked down. He had been through this endless times with his mother. "I know, Father. I lost my way." It no longer worked on Mom, but Joey hoped that the explanation would be enough to placate the priest. "Maybe we can help you find it." Father Randazzo opened his arms, and Joey happily gave his old friend a hug. Feeling like everything was going to be all right, he joked, "No grabbing my ass now, Padre. Mom's in the room." He was pleased to see that the priest was laughing too, even if it seemed a bit forced. Clearly, his mother didn't find the joke nearly as funny. Giving Joey a hard smack upside his head, Mrs. Quesada glared at him as he ducked away from another potential blow. "What? I'm kidding." Not funny. She was in no mood for his antics. Hoping to restore the peace, Father Randazzo held up his hands. All right, so what can I do for you two?" Still staring daggers at her son, Mrs. Quesada said, "My son needs a job, Father. Janitor, something in the lunchroom. Immediately, the priest shook his head. I don't think the lunchroom is a proper place for a wrestler. As if this settled an argument that he and his mother had been having since birth, Joey declared triumphantly, "That's what I've been saying." Not ready to give up so easily, Joey's mom pressed the kindly priest further. "These are tough times for him, Father. Anything, please." She knew if she left it up to her son, he would never get a real job. He was a full-time dreamer to the end. Instead of focusing on the request, Father Randazzo looked his former pupil over. "You know, I caught one of your matches not too long ago. Very exciting." Pleasantly surprised by this new wrinkle, Joey was eager to hear specifics. "You're kidding. Which one?" Frowning, the priest said, "It was at St. Agnes, around Halloween." He nodded as if confirming his memory of a poor outcome. Crestfallen, Joey visibly sagged, "Damn, I lost that night." He scratched his head apologetically. "I believe you fought an Irish gentleman." Seeing a chance to really show what he could do, Joey replied, "Wait, I fight here this week. You have to come. I'll hook you up with tickets." He would keep the preordained result to himself. Why spoil a good thing? "I am the principal, so tickets won't be—" "Promise you'll be there," Joey pleaded. "I'll do my best." Father Randazzo wanted to support his former student, but he couldn't make any promises. Things were getting shaky at bingo lately, and keeping those disgruntled seniors in check was a painstaking task. Still, this was enough to encourage Joey. "See, Ma? This man understands me. Always has. Father, remember the time we went camping with Scally? I was only in the 6th grade, but you still let me practice my wrestling moves on you." Suddenly uncomfortable, the priest looked at his former student. Not reading the room, Joey kept on reminiscing. Out loud. "Scally and I didn't have tights, so we got in our underwear." Frowning, the principal shook his head. "That's not— No, I mean, you showed restraint. You're a priest. Me and Scally were altar boys, camping in the woods, no one around. See? You understood me. Us. You get boys. I mean, men." An uncomfortable silence set in as Mrs. Casada and the priest looked at each other before turning to an embarrassed Joey. It took a minute, but every once in a while his brain caught up to his mouth. Finally, Father Randazzo knew it was time to fill in Joey's memory gaps. I remember that story a little differently. He started as gently as he could. With a sigh, the priest began to recount exactly what had happened. Way back in the summer of 1986, the much younger priest had been in charge of a group of students, but it was Joey and Scally who had consumed much of his time and energy. He had pitched their tents away from the others because it kept the two boys from starting widespread shenanigans that would reverberate throughout the camp. Keeping them apart and out of trouble was Father Randazzo's #1 concern. Enjoying a slight reprieve, he sat on a beach chair reading a book with a flashlight, waiting for the next wave of chaos that was bound to erupt from his two primary charges. As Joey stumbled out of his tent, the priest let out a sigh. The only question was, what was it this time? Joey gave him a goofy grin, and his words were decidedly slurred when he said, "Figure 4 leg lock. You have to let me try it on you." He stumbled forward. Looking up from his book, Father Randazzo's brown hair moved with the breeze. Hoping to diffuse the situation quickly, he asked, "You okay, Joseph?" "Pile driver, then. Scally's too small. I practice on him, it's no challenge." Shaking his head, the priest said, "Go back to sleep. We're fishing first thing." Moving around and nearly falling over, Joey clearly wasn't interested in listening. "Come on, Father." "A suplex. Or a body slam, at least. None of the kids are ever my size." The overgrown 6th grader had managed to get close enough for the priest to catch a whiff of something familiar. He narrowed his eyes. "Joseph, have you been drinking?" Joey's eyes went wide for a second before he did his best to play it off. Clumsily, he tried to steady his sway and stand normally. "Drinking." "No, why would you—" His mouth transformed from saying words to opening like a chasm. A loud belch echoed around them. Joey, refusing to acknowledge what that meant, pressed forward. "Why would you ask that?" Concern spread through Father Randazzo, as he was certain they hadn't brought any of their own alcohol. Short of performing a strip search on the rascals, that just couldn't be the case. Patting down his clothes, he quickly stood up, a sense of panic growing. "Where's my—" All the confirmation the young priest needed stumbled out of the tent in the form of a 4.5-foot tall Robert Scally. He smacked the side of the tent, plowed forward into the dirt, his body going spread eagle. A flask was in his hand. To the priest's horror, all the kid was wearing was a pair of tidy whities. But Scally did not seem even remotely embarrassed. The scrawny twerp was barely coherent as he whooped, "Woo-hoo! I am hammered!" Putting on his most disappointed expression, Father Randazzo stepped forward. "Robert, you hand me that flask right now." Pulling the flask to his chest as if it were a favorite toy, Scally slurred back under a very drunken grin. "Flask is yours, Father, soon as I empty it." He laughed impishly before taking a large swig, and continued to laugh as he pushed himself up off the ground. Stepping closer to his charge, Father Randazzo said in a stern voice, "You heard what I said, young man. Unless you want your parents to hear about this, you'll hand that over pronto. Parents, we're here to wrestle, Father. Look, I even brought my tights." At this, Scally posed in some very inappropriate ways, particularly given his current attire. He ended by trying a spin that nearly took out one of the tents. Knowing that he could get in serious trouble, both for what the kids were wearing or not wearing and their drunken state, the priest marched forward barking, "Okay, that's it!" He charged at Scally. Moments like this were usually precursors to fingerprints and mugshots. Prepared to deke out the priest but hoping it didn't come to that, Scally shouted, "Joey, take him!" a hair away from grabbing Scally. Father Randazzo felt someone grab him from behind instead. A wide grin formed on Joey's face as he readied the priest for an atomic drop. The devastating wrestling move knocked the wind right out of the holy man. With his opponent now on the ground, Joey refused to relent, and a flying elbow followed suit. Seeing his chance to finally turn the tables on someone larger than himself, even though everyone was larger than himself, Scally happily threw himself into the fray. The scene was absolute mayhem. Father Randazzo continuously reached futilely for the flask in Scally's hand, even as he was continuously pummeled from all angles. Joey was in heaven. Finally, wrestling moves were being performed on someone his own size, maybe even an inch or two taller. By the time a ceasefire was called and the flask was safely returned to its rightful owner, Father Randazzo was battered, bruised, covered in dirt, and more than ready to drag both Tasmanian devils back home to their parents. But this was simply not worth the trouble. After angrily sending the equally spent boys off to bed, the priest went to take a well-deserved swig from his flask, but it was empty. Looking around where they had just brawled, he noticed that there wasn't any liquor spilled on the ground. Rubbing his forehead, Father Randazzo surmised that Scally at least had a talent of some note. Entering his tent to put away the flask, the priest poked his head back out to make sure no one was looking. Then, he pulled out his emergency supply of Jack Daniels. He was going to sleep soundly this night one way or the other. Back in the present, Father Randazzo finally wrapped up his tale of the summer of 1986, conveniently leaving out the more lurid details. Joey nodded nonetheless. "Oh yeah, that's what happened." Mrs. Quesada shared a relieved look with the priest. Not that it made her feel much better because she was still clearly embarrassed by her son. Oh well, so much for that job. "Thanks for your time, Father. I guess we'll, She grabbed Joey's arm and started to pull him towards the door. Waving away her concern, Father Randazzo said, "Don't be silly, both of you. Joseph is still a wonderful athlete, and I have just the position for him." Stunned by this response, Mrs. Quesada's mouth fell open. She quickly composed herself and asked, "You do?" Chapter 5. Obstacle Course of Doom. Pleased with his position as STA's new resident gym teacher, Joey stood in front of a group of 7th graders. He was assessing them just as much as they were assessing him. For his first day, Joey had chosen to wear his signature wrestling singlet and a whistle that dangled from a thin band around his neck. Scally stood by his side, arms folded across his chest to look more authoritative. Many of the students were already taller than him. Was Scally hired as well by the generous priest? Who could tell? He probably would have shown up anyway. Not sure what to wear, the undersized adult, if you could call him that, sported sweats and a wife beater. You know, the usual. Holding a clipboard, he was clearly the administrator of the 2 unqualified teachers, but he also wasn't feeling well. It wasn't the cold or the flu, mind you, he just had a hangover. The kids either didn't notice or didn't care. Behind the 2 teachers was an elaborate obstacle course, which mere mortals would normally need days to construct. Somehow Joey and Scally slapped it together in a mere matter of minutes. Several of the students whispered amongst themselves in awe of this spectacle, and Joey grinned in pride at his own handiwork. Beside him, Scally took things in through the haze and discomfort of his former night's transgressions. "And he gave you the basketball team too?" Smiling down, Joey said, "Gym and basketball. Not bad, huh? But you don't know anything about basketball." With a shrug, Joey pointed out, "That's why you're my assistant. I'm your assistant in gym. Why don't you be my assistant in basketball?" "Because I'll never be your assistant in anything." Joey turned and glared at Scally. Taking a step back, Scally muttered, "Okay, man, no need to get personal." He squeezed his eyes with his free hand before saying, "I still can't believe they pay us for this." "It gets better," Joey said just before blowing the whistle. It was time to get the real fun started. "Okay, everyone, settle down." Immediately, things began to go off the rails. One of the 7th graders pointed at Joey and cried, "You're the one who cut the lunch line." Another pitched in, "I saw him wrestle last week. Shamrock kicked his ass." Whatever he was going to say to the line-cutting accusation was quickly lost at the mention of the man who had caused him so much pain and humiliation. Frowning, Joey warned the wisecracker, "That name is forbidden in this class henceforth." Instead of inspiring fear, one of the other kids laughed, "Nice uniform, douche." The rest of the class joined in on the verbal abuse toward their teacher. Joey blew harder on his whistle and shot everyone his best villain glare. "Enough! I need your full attention so no one gets hurt." The threat of actual physical harm finally got the class to go quiet. Joey pressed forward. "In front of you stands today's obstacle course. It's filled with danger and excitement. It'll also teach you something very valuable in the end." He was pleased by the student's sudden change in demeanor. Turning to his assistant, Joey said, "Line 'em up." Baffled, Scally looked around. "Where?" Joey stared deadpan as if it were obvious. "At the starting line." Scally continued to look around. "Where's that?" Exasperated, Joey threw up his hands. At the begin, one look at Scally, and Joey knew that he had to make it impossible for the knucklehead to miss. Scally missed a lot. Pointing directly at the starting point, Joey said, "There!" Scally strolled over, turned, and gave a big thumbs up. Addressing his students, Joey shouted, "Everybody behind Scally, single file!" As the kids followed their teacher's instruction to the letter, Joey trotted to the other end of the obstacle course. Hollering to his friend, Joey asked, "Scal, they ready?" Looking around, not sure what was needed for them to be ready, he replied, I guess so. On my mark, send them through one at a time." Looking down at his clipboard, Scally used his finger to scan the names. "Mark? I have 3 mats, but no marks." Rolling his eyes, Joey said, "No, not." Realizing there was no hope in trying to explain what he meant, Joey shouted, "When I say go, okay? So send the mats first." "I don't care who you send first. Just send them one at a time. Ready? Go." Deciding it was too much work figuring out which ones were the mats, and if there really weren't any marks, Scally just gave a quick shove to the kid closest to the starting area. The happy-go-lucky kid did a great job making his way through the obstacles, and when he neared the end, he noticed Joey standing at the finish line looking happy as well. This strange being in a wrestling singlet must have just been there waiting to congratulate him for a job well done. Scrambling through the finish line, happy-go-lucky emerged, beaming. He wanted to let his teacher know that it wasn't that difficult, even though he was a little out of breath. Before he could deliver his Yelp rating, though, Joey struck him with a flying clothesline, knocking not-so-happy-go-lucky clear off his feet. Back at the other end of the course, Scally continued to send stunned kids through one at a time. They moved increasingly slower through the maze now that they knew what lesson was waiting for them on the other side. Regardless of their pace, each was eventually met with a devastating wrestling move from their new teacher. He was merciless, doling out body slams, drop kicks, flying elbows, anything he could think of to let them know who was boss. Scally sent the last student through, feeling a little sorry for Stewie. The tiny runt reminded Scally of himself in a way. And, unlike most of the other kids, Stewie struggled through many of the obstacles. Joey watched Stewie's progress with devilish delight. Behind him, the other kids were sprawled out on the floor panting from their lessons, and now Joey was about to deliver the final one. When Stewie finally reached the end, Joey leapt at him, a huge cat-like grin on his face. Suddenly, Stewie moved much faster than he had during the course. Sidestepping Joey's attack, he watched as his teacher hit the floor splat and then sprung into further action. He dove on top of Joey before Joey could even grasp what was happening. Busting out the signature move of his favorite wrestler John Cena, Stewie delivered the five-knuckle shuffle with utter perfection. The tiny but powerful runt then finished off his wannabe teacher with a vicious chokehold otherwise known as the attitude adjustment, another signature move of Cena's. Stewie's heroes were more modern than Joey's heroes, and it showed. Unable to see from his vantage point what all the commotion was about, Scally dashed to the end of the course. He arrived just in time to see his best friend being tapped out by Joey's first victim, who was now playing referee. Stewie leaped up and held his hands in a victory pose. Suddenly, all the other 7th graders forgot about their crushed pride as they stood and roared their approval for this unexpected twist. Joey looked up just long enough to witness his own new low before collapsing in humiliation. Covering his face, he was no longer certain that this new ideal job was so ideal after all. Chapter 6. A Tiny Slam from Glory. After his disastrous day at the office, so to speak, Joey could not wait for his next fight. No 85-pound Stewies would get in the way of that preordained win, if he could just lift and slam Tiny. As he entered the STA locker room in pre-fight attire tingling in anticipation, Joey made his way to a group of wrestlers clustered around someone he couldn't see. As some of the wrestlers parted for him like the Red Sea, Joey was suddenly face-to-face with the well-dressed Salvatore Morelli, president of Brawl. Lou, who was standing next to Morelli, really had been serious. This was definitely cause for everyone to bring their A-game. Joey's face brimmed with startled excitement. "Mr. Morelli?" Morelli, also of Italian descent, turned and took in the new arrival. "You must be the Italian dream." As the two fellow Italians shook hands, Patty Shamrock muttered, "More like the Italian catnap." Seeing that Patty had actually appeared in the locker room for once, Joey shot back. "So now you grace us with your presence. As soon as the president of the league shows up." Opening his mouth toward Morelli as if to say something in his defense, Patty decided to hold his tongue, knowing that the other wrestlers would only take Joey's side. He simply replied, "Whatever." With that retort, he left. No one was disappointed by this. Turning back to the big boss, Joey asked, "What brings you here, Mr. Morelli? Scouting for high school venues?" "Actually, my son goes to this school." "He does? What grade? I teach gym." Wait, maybe Joey shouldn't have mentioned that. He wasn't about to receive glowing referrals from his students just yet, or ever. "Second," Morelli answered. "Cool, I'll make sure I go easy on him." With a hearty laugh, Morelli said, "Good luck tonight. It's nice to have a fellow Italian to root for." Giving Joey a pat on the back, Morelli headed out toward the gym and the other wrestlers dispersed. Joey called after him, "Thanks, Mr. Morelli." His excitement now at a crescendo, he turned to Lou, who was looking coy. "You hear that, Lou? Fellow Italian. This could be my big break." With a knowing smile, Lou said, "You never know. If I could just slam Tiny." On cue, Joey spotted Tiny leaning against his locker, devouring an overstuffed meatball hero. Frustrated, Joey exclaimed, "Damn it, Tiny! You have to eat before the match? Hard enough to pick you up as it is." Tiny just gave him a nonplussed shrug, causing one of the meatballs to wiggle precariously in the sandwich. Then, as he followed the last of the other wrestlers out, the meatball made its escape and exploded on the floor. Tiny gave it no mind. Joey was startled by a familiar voice.
"Don't you remember WrestleMania 3, brother?"
Standing where Lou had just been was suddenly Joey's hero, who knew a lot about hair dye prices. As if this was a routine occurrence, Hulk Hogan continued casually.
"They said no one could slam that nasty giant."
"You're right, but that was a bit of a squeaker," Joey said with equal matter-of-factness.
"Did I lift him and drop him or not?"
"You definitely dropped him." Hogan narrowed his eyes.
"Never use sarcasm on your hero, especially when he possesses the ability to rip off your limbs."
Not willing to back down, Joey said, "Hulkster, your legs were shaking when you had the giant up. And didn't you tear something in your back?"
"No one cares about the details, just slam the man. The giant was twice the size of Tiny."
Unfortunately, Joey shot back, "And you're twice the size of me."
"Then the math works out perfectly."
Hogan grabbed Joey by the back of the neck and repeatedly rammed his head against one of the lockers. Lou, who had moved to another part of the room, turned toward the disturbance. But it wasn't Hogan who was slamming Joey into the locker. It was Joey slamming himself. Lou continued to watch perplexed as Joey then crashed a chair over his head. There was no one else near him. Morelli strolled back in from the gym. "Lou, you need to do something about these pathetic ticket sales." He never finished that thought, though, as the antics of the Italian Dream immediately caught his attention. Wow, this guy's really committed to his work. With a non-committal shrug, Lou replied, "He's committed all right, or should be." The match between Joeylicious and Tiny began like all the rest. First, Tiny was introduced by the announcer, who also doubled as the referee due to budgetary constraints. Then, Tiny worked the sporadic but boisterous crowd as they howled and threw whatever they could get their mitts on at him. This was followed with the glorious introduction and entrance of Joeylicious. For once, the Tower of Power, who was too sweet to be sour, was not the challenger. Not that he was defending a belt or anything. The only belt Joey or his alter ego owned was from J.C. Penney. But Joeylicious was the hometown hero to this motley crew of a misfit audience, so he got whatever cheers they could muster. And now the actual wrestling kicked in. Among the spectators in the STA gym that was even smaller than the usual brawl venue was Father Randazzo, who watched with interest but with none of the fans' exuberance. Morelli and his 8-year-old son sat a few rows behind the priest with their eyes glued. Little Morelli was especially enthralled with the proceedings. In the row just behind Brawl's royal family was Scally holding his usual styrofoam cup of beer. As things in the ring heated up, all parties acted accordingly. Joeylicious was making his way toward his preordained victory, stunning his opponent with chops and kicks that kept Tiny reeling. Facing someone who relied on strength over agility made it easy for the STA alumni to put on a good show. It was like beating the side of a barn that moved like a melting glacier. Or a barn. Now all Joeylicious had to do was get Tiny in the air. Somehow. He feverishly worked himself up to what he still thought was an impossible feat. The bigger problem was that Tiny was starting to fade, sliding further and further down the ropes with each hit. Joeylicious knew that once Tiny hit canvas, he became canvas. Fearing that his best friend and favorite wrestler might lose a golden opportunity, Scally jumped to his feet and hopped up and down to egg him on. "Come on, Joey, body slam him!" The words were clear, and for a second Joeylicious stopped and looked around the gym. This was his home turf, and he just had to deliver. Struggling to remain vertical, Tiny grunted, "Do it, Lish! I can't stay up much longer." As if to prove his point, Tiny fell against the ropes once more and seemed unable to stop his body from continuing its slide to the canvas this time. Realizing that it was now or never, Joeylicious went into desperation mode. He thrust himself under Tiny, felt for enough flab to get a good grip and actually lift the behemoth. His opponent was slick with sweat, and from this close, the Italian Dream could smell the meatball sandwich on Tiny's breath. Glad that he would have to hold his own breath to actually slam Tiny, Joeylicious sucked in his gut. With the 300-plus-pound sweat gland finally in the air, St. Thomas's own wobbled, just like Hulk Hogan did with Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3. This was as precarious as it could get, but Joeylicious had one last burst of energy left. He dug deep, real deep as he ever had in his entire wrestling career, and slammed Tiny to the canvas with a roaring thud. The crowd went wild. Scally was so fired up that he even did the unimaginable. He spilled his beer. Of course the beer went all over Morelli's 8-year-old son. As if Morelli felt the impact of the beer himself, he immediately looked down at his soaked kid, and then leaped up to confront Scally. "You imbecile. You just gave my son a bath." Still excited, Scally brushed it off. "Relax, Goomba. What are you gonna whack me now? You have any idea who you're talking to? You seem like a typical greaseball to me." Scally shot back, certain this clown was just another fan too big for his britches. Little Morelli burst into tears. Scally, now with a new source of entertainment to revel in, spouted to anyone who would listen, "Hey look, the greaseball's kid needs a lesson in manhood." Big Morelli snarled, "That's it." And with surprising speed and agility, he threw himself at Scally, taking both of them to the floor. Completely unaware of the fiasco taking place in the bleachers, Joeylicious waited patiently for the ref to do his job. Once he heard the count of 3, Joeylicious leapt off the spent behemoth and extended his victorious arms into the air. As he pumped his fists, he couldn't help but to cut his celebration short so he could scan to where the president of Brawl had been sitting. Fully expecting Morelli's instant approval, Joey's eyes darted back and forth, unable to find his salvation. Then a well-dressed man stood up in the middle of a brawl apparently occurring in the crowd. Worse than that, this same well-dressed man was apparently pounding on a very familiar, scrawny figure. No! Joey dashed under the ropes and made his way toward the mayhem, hoping that he was hallucinating. He arrived just in time to see Morelli and Scally being pulled apart, with the president clearly coming out the winner. Like laser beams, Joey's furious eyes locked in on his soon-to-be former best friend. "Scally, you idiot." Father Randazzo had managed to sneak away from the ruckus before it got out of hand. Knowing how things would end, though, the good priest could only shake his head in disappointment as he made his way to the exit. Morelli turned his anger toward Joey. "You know this guy?" Too late, Joey realized his mistake. Trying to backpedal, he shook his head. No, why would you? I never saw him before. You just called him by name." Misreading the looks Joey was throwing at him for an attempted bailout, Scally cozied up to his pal. "Me and Joe are best buds. What's it to you, greaseball?" Motioning to security, Morelli said, "Get him out of here." Two large security guards grabbed Scally and carried him toward the exit. One guard would have easily been enough. Stunned, Scally said, "Hey, what'd I do? Joe, talk to these guys, will ya? Let me down." With one problem out of the way, Morelli turned back to Joey. "And you have yourself a nice career." The president gave a quick move of his hand, and two more security guards moved in. Grabbing Joey, they started toward the exit as well. In a panic over his complete reversal of fortune, Joey yelled out, "Wait, Mr. Morelli, I won!" Like a squiggly eel, he struggled to break free from the men hauling him away. It was no use. Several other security guards joined in on Joey's removal, including one familiar-looking one with thinning blonde locks. As Joey was lifted into the air to prevent him from gaining any traction, the Italian Dream continued to plead with the president. "You were going to bump me up to high school venues. I'm Italian." With a mocking smile, Morelli waved at the wrestling peasant before turning his attentions to his son. After watching his father beat up the loser who had soaked him with beer, little Morelli seemed far less upset. Thinning blonde locks chided Joey as he continued to help escort him out of the gym with the rest of security.
Your big break, huh?
Knowing he was defeated, Joey sagged. "Tell me about it." But then he quickly realized who was making fun of him. "Hulkster, you're in on this. This place has more security than fans." With a knowing smile, Hulk Hogan said,
We'll straighten you out. Eventually.
Confused, Joey looked around to see who or what Hogan was referring to. "Eventually? Who's we?" Hogan simply laughed as the aspiring wrestler was finally hauled through the threshold of the exit sign.